Picture this. You're sitting in your cabin, and you watch the last piece of wood in your possession turn to ash. Not the last cord of wood, not the last stack, the last piece. And outside? 40 degrees below zero. Now, I know what you're thinking. We've all had that moment of panic when the heat goes out in winter. You call the utility company, you wrap yourself in blankets, maybe the temperature drops to 55 degrees inside your house. Uncomfortable, right? This isn't that. This is December 1823 in Montana Territory, where 40 below zero doesn't mean bundle up. It means your spit freezes before it hits the ground. It means exposed skin dies in less than 5 minutes. It means, and this is the detail that should terrify you, water that you just pulled from your well, steaming hot from your efforts, freezes solid in the bucket before you can walk it back inside your cabin. We're talking minutes here, people, not hours. And Jedediah Strong, 32 years old, son of a Pennsylvania stonemason, watches that last log crumble to nothing. Now, Strong wasn't some greenhorn who'd wandered into the mountains on a whim. He'd been out here for 5 years, making his living the way mountain men did beaver pelts. Beautiful, dense, waterproof beaver pelts that European hat makers couldn't get enough of. This was serious money, the kind of money that made men walk away from civilization and embrace a life where your nearest neighbor was 15 miles away. 15 miles. In 40 below weather, you see where I'm going with this? But here's what really makes this situation desperate. Strong knew his geography. He'd trapped every valley and creek within a week's walk. The closest unclaimed timber, the stuff he could legally harvest without starting a war, stood 3 days' journey away. 3 days through territory controlled by the Blackfeet, who'd made it abundantly clear that white trappers weren't exactly welcome. And even if he made that journey, even if he somehow didn't freeze to death or catch an arrow, he'd have to haul enough wood back to last through 2 more months of winter. 2 months. At 40 below, the math just didn't work. So Strong sits there in his cabin as the temperature begins to drop. Not gradually, that's the thing about extreme cold. Once your heat source dies, the warmth doesn't linger. It flees. Within an hour, his breath becomes visible inside. Within 2 hours, frost begins forming on the interior walls. And outside, in the endless darkness of a Montana winter night, because we're talking about maybe 4 hours of dim daylight this time of year, the wolves start their chorus. Have you ever heard wolves howl? I mean really heard them, not in a documentary, but in person, knowing they're close? It's a sound that reaches something primal in human beings, something that remembers when we were prey. Now imagine hearing that sound when you're trapped, when you're powerless, when you're watching your survival slip away with every degree the temperature drops. Strong had one advantage. Just one. And it came from the most unlikely source, his Shoshone wife, Morning Mist. Now, the historical record gets a little fuzzy on how they met, but what we do know is this. She'd once told him about valleys where the earth breathes warmth even in deepest winter. Steam rising from pools when snow falls. Places her people considered sacred. Places they visited when medicine needed to be strong. At the time, Strong probably catalogued this information the way you might remember someone mentioning a good restaurant in a city you might never visit. Interesting, maybe useful someday, but not urgent. But now, with frostbite beginning to creep into his extremities, with his water supply frozen, with death becoming not just possible but probable, now those words become a lifeline. The problem is that Morning Mist had been vague about locations. The Shoshone didn't exactly maintain GPS, coordinates of their sacred sites. She'd mentioned following elk in winter, watching where they gathered when storms came, something about steam dreams, which Strong took to mean the visible vapor rising from thermal features. So, here's where it gets desperate. Strong makes a choice that should tell you everything you need to know about his situation. He goes out into the blizzard. Not in the morning. Not with supplies and planning. Right then, in the middle of a Montana winter night, in 40 below temperature, with wolves howling close enough that he can hear individual animals. He goes because staying means dying slowly, and maybe, just maybe, dying while moving toward a solution beats dying while doing nothing. The historical record, pieced together from Strong's later journal entries, tells us he followed elk tracks. Now, Elk are survivors. They've been dealing with Rocky Mountain winters for thousands of years. They know things. They know where thermal features create patches of exposed ground, where warm updrafts melt the snow, where winter becomes just slightly less deadly. So, Strong follows their trails through a blizzard that reduces visibility to arm's length, through cold that makes every breath feel like inhaling knives, through conditions that kill experienced outdoorsmen. He later wrote that he lost feeling in his fingers after the first hour. After the second hour, he stopped being able to feel his face. By the third hour, he was moving on pure stubbornness, following tracks more by memory than sight, because his eyes kept trying to freeze shut. And then he stumbles through the blowing snow into a hidden canyon, and the temperature changes. Not gradually. Suddenly. He feels it first as just an absence of pain, which after hours in 40 below cold might as well be heaven. And then he sees them. Pools. Multiple pools, their surfaces rippling with convection, mineral deposits creating otherworldly colors around their edges, yellows and oranges and reds from iron and sulfur compounds. Steam rising in columns that the blizzard wind catches and scatters. And the temperature of this water? 160 degrees. Hot enough to cook food, hot enough to cause serious burns, hot enough to create a microclimate where snow falls on the rocks at the edge of the pools and melts before it can accumulate. Strong collapses at the edge of the nearest pool, and that's when he realizes just how close he'd cut it. His fingers, when he finally manages to look at them in the dim light, remember, it's night, and he's in a blizzard, so we're talking about almost no visibility. His fingers are black. Not frostbitten red, black. The deep tissue damage kind of black, the might lose them kind of black. He has perhaps 12 hours before the cold winds anyway. 12 hours to figure out how to transform this geological miracle into salvation. 12 hours to solve a problem that would challenge a modern engineer with tools and materials and electricity. 12 hours with frozen hands, exhausted body, and only the knowledge his stonemason father taught him about heating systems for Pennsylvania churches. The clock is ticking, the blizzard isn't stopping, and Jedediah Strong is about to engineer a solution that will change the Rocky Mountain frontier forever. But first, he has to make it through the night. So Strong survives the night. Barely. He spends those dark hours huddled next to the hottest pool he can find without actually scalding himself, rotating like a rotisserie chicken to keep hypothermia at bay. And somewhere in that exhausted, half-frozen delirium, his mind starts working through a problem that seems absolutely insane. How do you get this heat from here to there? Now, I want you to understand something about the gap between having a resource and being able to use it. Strong has found pools of water hot enough to brew tea. His cabin is, he estimates later, maybe half a mile away through dense forest and rock outcroppings. Half a mile doesn't sound like much, right? But we're talking about moving 160-degree water through Montana winter, in 1823, with no modern materials, no plastic, no metal pipes, no hardware store down the road. What he does have is a memory. Strong's father was a stonemason in Philadelphia, and young Jedediah had spent his childhood as his father's helper on various projects. One of those projects, and this is the detail that saves his life, was installing heating channels beneath the floors of churches. You see, wealthy churches in the early 1800s were starting to experiment with Roman-style hypocaust systems, channels built under the floor, hot air or water flowing through them, radiating heat upward. It wasn't common, but Strong had seen it work. More importantly, he'd helped build them with his own hands. The principle was simple. The execution? That's where things get interesting. Strong starts with the most basic question. What can he use for pipes? Metal is out, he doesn't have it, can't make it, can't acquire it. Pottery is out for the same reasons. So he looks at what's available, and what's available is wood. Specifically, fallen lodgepole pines. These trees grow straight as arrows, and when they fall, they can lie in the forest for years before rotting. Strong realizes he can hollow them out, create wooden pipes, but how do you hollow out a log when your fingers are blackened with frostbite and you're working by moonlight in sub-zero temperatures? This is where the thermal springs themselves become tools. Strong heats stones in the hottest pools, volcanic rocks that can withstand rapid temperature changes without exploding. Morning Mist, who's tracking him down after he disappeared into the blizzard, arrives on the second day and immediately starts sorting through rocks, teaching him which ones will hold heat longest, which ones will crack, which ones will shatter. This knowledge, passed down through Shoshone generations who'd used these springs for ceremonies and healing, proves absolutely critical. The technique they develop is brutal in its simplicity. Heat a stone until it's almost too hot to handle, and we're talking stones that glow slightly in the dark, then place it inside the log and let it burn out a section. Move the stone, burn out another section. Hour after hour, day after day. The smell of scorched pine filling the air. His hands, already damaged, getting worse with each hour of work. Morning Mist's grandmother, a medicine woman who arrives on the third day with a group of Shoshone who winter near the valley, brings knowledge that proves equally vital. She knows which springs produce which minerals. She knows that the white crust around certain pools, when crushed and mixed with pine pitch, creates a sealant that can withstand hot water. She knows that different pools have different temperatures, some at 160 degrees, others at 120, some at 90, and that mixing these flows can give you exactly the temperature you need. This becomes crucial because Strong's first attempt at running hot water through a wooden pipe ends with the pipe literally catching fire from the inside. 160-degree water through a wooden channel, the wood starts to char, so he has to engineer a mixing system right at the source, blending the hottest water with cooler flows to get something around 130 degrees hot enough to provide meaningful heat, cool enough not to destroy his delivery system. But even at 130 degrees, problems emerge. The first complete pipe system he builds, 17 feet of hollowed lodgepole running from the springs toward his cabin, works perfectly for exactly 6 hours. Then, the temperature outside drops particularly hard. The water inside the pipe begins to freeze at a point where the flow slows, and the whole thing bursts, explodes, splits. The wood, like an axe, hit it. Strong sits in the snow, staring at his destroyed work, and this is where lesser men would quit. But he's already committed days to this project. His food supplies are running low, and going back to trying to survive without heat means certain death, so he starts problem-solving like an engineer. The issue is flow interruption. Water needs to keep moving or it freezes. So Strong develops what he later calls his beaver system. See, Strong had spent 5 years trapping beavers, studying their dams, understanding how they regulate water flow. Beavers are master hydraulic engineers. They build dams with overflow channels, secondary spillways, and pressure release mechanisms that would impress modern civil engineers. Strong applies these same principles. He creates a main channel from the hot springs with multiple offshoots, a primary flow to his cabin, but also secondary channels that feed back into other pools. This keeps water constantly moving through the entire system. He angles everything at about 15 degrees, steep enough for gravity to maintain flow, but not so steep that the water races through and doesn't transfer heat effectively. And he builds in overflow valves using techniques copied directly from beaver dams, loose-packed stones that water can seep through if pressure builds too high. Then there's the grizzly bear problem. I mentioned this almost casually, but let's dwell on it for a moment. A grizzly bear, a creature that can weigh 800 pounds and kill a man with one swipe, decides that the warmest thermal pool is the perfect place to spend the winter. This bear is groggy, irritable, and very much not interested in sharing. Strong needs access to that pool because it has the most consistent temperature and the best mineral composition for his sealant mixture. So for 3 days, he and this bear engage in a standoff that would be comical if it weren't so potentially lethal. Eventually, Strong and Morning Mist build an elaborate rock barrier that gives the bear most of the pool but allows them access to one section. The bear, apparently deciding that 3/4 of a hot pool beats fighting over the whole thing, accepts the arrangement. 17 days after finding the springs, Strong completes his system. Multiple hollowed logs, carefully sealed with mineral pitch compound, angled precisely, with mixing valves that let him control temperature, overflow channels that prevent bursting, and the whole thing running on nothing but gravity and Earth's heat. He opens the final valve, and hot water begins flowing through the channels he's carved beneath his cabin floor. The temperature inside rises. Slowly, at first, you can't rush this kind of heat transfer. But within 2 hours, the interior reaches 50 degrees. Within 6 hours, 60. By the next morning, his cabin maintains a steady 68 degrees, while outside the temperature sits at 35 below zero. 68 degrees. Let that sink in. Comfortable room temperature. In the middle of a Montana winter, with no wood burning, no fuel consumption, just water, heat from the earth, and engineering that would have impressed Roman bathhouse designers. Strong documents everything in his journal, and here's where we get lucky historically, because this man kept detailed records. He writes in charcoal on birch bark, because paper is a luxury he doesn't have. He measures flow rates at 3 gallons per minute. He notes the optimal pipe angle of 15 degrees. And he discovers, through trial and error, that adding vinegar to his system once a month prevents the minerals dissolved in the thermal water from depositing inside the pipes and blocking flow. That last detail, the vinegar trick, shows you the level of sophistication Strong achieves. He's not just moving hot water, he's maintaining a system, preventing scale build-up, thinking long-term about operational efficiency. This is frontier, hydroengineering, at a level that shouldn't exist yet. And here's the thing that really matters. Strong doesn't die. His fingers, blackened and painful, eventually heal. He loses parts of 2 fingers to frostbite, but he keeps his hands. His cabin stays warm through the entire winter, and word of what he's accomplished begins to spread through the mountains, in the way word spreads among mountain men through chance encounters at rendezvous points, through trading partners, through the wilderness telegraph of survival stories. Because in January 1824, a man named Black Harris is going to stumble into Strong's Valley, nearly dead from exposure, and find a cabin that's impossibly warm in the middle of winter. And that's when things get really interesting. Black Harris is dying. That's not dramatic exaggeration. He's actually in the process of dying from exposure when he sees smoke rising from Strong's Valley in January 1824. Except, and this is what confuses his hypothermic brain, the smoke isn't coming from a chimney. It's steam, rising from the thermal pools, and there in the middle of this frozen hellscape sits a cabin with no smokestack actively burning. Yet when Harris stumbles through the door, the interior feels like a Philadelphia parlor in springtime. Harris later tells people he thought he'd died and gone to heaven, or hell. He wasn't quite sure which. Within 6 hours of warming up, after Strong feeds him hot broth and wraps his frost-bitten feet, Harris starts asking questions. How? How is this possible? How are you heating this cabin? And Strong faces the first iteration of a decision that's going to define the rest of his life. Does he tell the truth, or does he make up some story about a miracle stove? Strong tells him everything, shows him the system, walks him out to the springs despite Harris's weakened condition, because seeing is believing, and nobody would believe this without seeing it. Harris spends 3 days recovering in Strong's warm cabin, watching hot water flow through wooden channels beneath the floor. And his mind is doing the same calculation any businessman would do. This changes everything. The mountain man economy runs on brutally simple math. You can trap beaver in warm months. You retreat to crude shelters in winter and try not to die. The season ends when winter arrives. But if you could stay warm, if you could maintain year-round operations, the first trapper to figure that out would become spectacularly wealthy. Harris leaves Strong's Valley and immediately starts talking. Not maliciously, mountain men are actually a pretty tight community when it comes to survival information, but he talks. And in the world of Rocky Mountain fur trappers, information travels through what historians call the mountain telegraph. Men meet at trading posts, at river crossings, at rendezvous points. They share stories, they share knowledge, they definitely share news about impossible warm cabins in the middle of Montana winter. By February, Jim Bridger shows up. If you know Western history, that name should mean something. Bridger becomes one of the most famous mountain men in American history. He's partnered with Joseph Walker, another legend in the making, and they've brought 5 other trappers with them. 7 men standing in Strong's cabin, feeling the warmth rising through the floorboards, and every single one of them understands they're looking at something revolutionary. Strong has to make his decision again. Times 7. And this is where his character shows through in ways the historical record preserves beautifully. He could patent this, in a manner of speaking, could claim exclusive rights to the springs, charge for access, build a monopoly on winter survival in the Rockies. Mountain men respect territorial claims. It's part of the unwritten code that keeps chaos from completely taking over. But Strong doesn't do that. Instead, he starts teaching them, shows them how to select logs, how to hollow them using heated stones, which minerals to mix with pine pitch, how to angle the channels, where to build overflow systems. Morning Mist and her grandmother teach the wives and partners of these mountain men the Shoshone knowledge about mineral balance and spring management. It becomes a knowledge transfer that crosses cultural boundaries in ways that were pretty rare on the frontier. Why does Strong share? His journal entries suggest a mix of motives. Partly practical, 7 more warm cabins means 7 more men who'll defend the valley against potential threats. Partly ethical, he'd nearly died himself, and that experience left him with strong feelings about withholding life-saving information. And partly strategic, because Strong understands something important. You can't really monopolize a geological feature that Shoshone people have known about for generations. Trying would just create conflict. But then, in March of 1825, the American Fur Company shows up, and we get a crash course in how frontier capitalism could turn ugly. William Ashley's representatives, we're talking about the American Fur Company, one of the most powerful economic forces in the West, arrive with lawyers, surveyors, and documents claiming ownership of the entire valley. They've discovered that the thermal springs fall into a territorial grey zone, technically unclaimed under federal law, and they want to establish a company monopoly, build a fort, charge rent, control access. The whole corporate takeover package. This triggers what Strong's journals call the Steam Valley Standoff, and it's one of those historical moments that sounds almost too perfect to be real, except we have multiple sources confirming it. Mountain men who'd normally compete with each other, French voyageurs, American trappers, Scottish traders unite against the company representatives. Shoshone warriors, led by Morning Mist uncle, make it clear they consider the springs sacred ground, and any attempt to fence them off will be met with force. Free trappers, Mexican merchants, even a couple of former Hudson's Bay Company men join what becomes a strange coalition defending common access. The standoff lasts 3 weeks. It never quite escalates to violence, but it comes close. The American Fur Company has legal documents. The mountain men have rifles and intimate knowledge of the terrain. The Shoshone have legitimate ancestral claims and the numbers to enforce them. It's a wilderness version of a labor dispute, and it ends with something remarkable, the Thermal Treaty of 1824. Now, calling it a treaty is probably generous. It's more like a handshake agreement written down by multiple parties and witnessed by everyone involved, but it establishes principles that work. The springs remain common ground. No single entity can claim exclusive access. Anyone can build heating systems, but they have to share knowledge freely with others. The Shoshone maintain authority over the surrounding land. The American Fur Company can establish a trading post at the valley entrance, but not around the springs themselves. It's primitive democracy in action, people. Different groups with competing interests finding a compromise that serves everyone better than endless conflict would. And it works. By the end of winter 1825, 12 permanent structures surround the springs, each one heated by Strong's system or variations thereof. The valley becomes something unprecedented on the frontier, a year-round community, not a seasonal camp, not a temporary trading post, a real community. And it becomes neutral ground in ways that matter tremendously for a region where tensions between different groups could turn lethal. French voyageurs sing their river songs next to cabins where American trappers store their pelts. Shoshone elders share traditional knowledge with Scottish traders. Mexican merchants dealing in silver goods do business with men who'd normally be competitors or enemies. The shared resource creates shared investment in peace. Strong's innovation doesn't just solve a heating problem, It creates a social space where the normal rules of frontier violence get suspended because everyone benefits from cooperation. The man who almost froze to death has accidentally engineered a model for multicultural collaboration in one of the most volatile regions of North America. But the real impact? That's still coming, because word is spreading beyond the Rockies, and by 1830, Strong's thermal heating design is going to be documented in 43 different locations from Montana to New Mexico. The ripple effect is just beginning, and it's going to change the entire pattern of Western expansion. Here's what happens when you share knowledge freely. In a world starving for it, the knowledge multiplies. By 1830, just 6 years after Strong nearly froze to death in his cabin, 43 documented geothermal heating systems are operating across the Rocky Mountain frontier. 43. From Montana down through Wyoming, Colorado, and into New Mexico. Every single one traced back to Strong's original design or taught by someone Strong personally instructed. Think about that rate of adoption. In an era where communication moves at the speed of horses and foot travel, where there's no internet, no telegraphs yet, no mass media, a technological innovation spreads across hundreds of miles of wilderness in just 6 years. That tells you something about how desperately needed this solution was. The economic impact is staggering. Winter fur harvests increase 300%. 300%. Because trappers who previously had to hunker down and survive winter can now work through it. Beaver don't stop being active in winter. They're actually easier to trap in some ways because their movements become more predictable. But human trappers couldn't survive the sustained exposure. Strong's heating systems change that equation completely. Seasonal camps become permanent trading posts. This is huge. Previously, the fur trade operated on a boom and bust cycle-intensive activity in warm months, then abandonment until spring. Now traders can maintain year-round operations. They can store goods through winter. They can process pelts continuously. They can build actual infrastructure instead of temporary shelters they'll abandon in 6 months. And then, families start arriving. This is the part that really alters the trajectory of Western expansion. Territories that were considered uninhabitable places where the army couldn't maintain forts, where the government couldn't send settlers suddenly become viable for permanent habitation. Women and children start appearing in regions that were previously the exclusive domain of tough, weathered mountain men. Not in huge numbers initially, but enough to establish the pattern, enough to create communities instead of just camps. Strong becomes something of a celebrity in this world. He starts creating detailed maps, and these aren't just geographical surveys. Strong marks thermal features. Hot springs, warm streams, geothermal vents anywhere that Earth's heat reaches the surface. Strong documents it. His maps use symbols that become standardized across the frontier, a rising spiral for hot springs, a wavy line for heated streams, dots for warm ground. These maps guide a generation of explorers. John Coulter, the legendary mountain man who's often credited with discovering Yellowstone, carries copies of Strong's maps. The Sublette brothers, who build a fur trading empire, use Strong's thermal surveys to plan their winter routes. When you read accounts from this era, Strong's name appears again and again not as a famous explorer or a wealthy fur baron, but as the man who made winter survival systematic rather than desperate. But then the world changes. By 1840, the Mountain Man era is ending. It doesn't collapse suddenly, it's more like a slow fade. Beaver populations are depleted from overhunting, fashion changes in Europe, and suddenly beaver pelts aren't commanding premium prices. The fur trade that built the Rocky Mountain economy is dying. Lesser men would be ruined. Strong adapts. He establishes what he calls a health resort near present-day Bozeman, Montana. And here's where Strong shows his business acumen, because he understands something about human nature people will pay for comfort. Exhausted gold rushers, heading to or from the California fields, discover that a hot soak in mineral water feels like heaven after weeks on the trail. Strong charges $5 for a therapeutic bath. $5 in 1845 is serious money, maybe $150 in modern terms, and people pay it gladly. The resort becomes successful enough that Strong builds additional cabins, hires staff, and starts offering multi-day packages. He's essentially invented the Western spa industry, native healing traditions, which Morning Mist and her community have practiced for generations, get combined with Strong's engineering expertise to create something commercially viable. It's cultural fusion, driven by market demand. By December 1847, hundreds of people have passed through Strong's resort. He's 64 years old, ancient by mountain man standards. Most men who lived his lifestyle are long dead by their 50s. But Strong has survived, adapted, and prospered through one of the most turbulent periods in American Western history. On his 64th birthday, hundreds of people gather to celebrate. Mountain men who learned his heating techniques decades earlier, Shoshone families who've maintained the sacred springs, traders who built their businesses around year-round operations his innovation enabled, gold rushers who found relief at his resort. It's a remarkable cross-section of frontier society, all connected through one man's refusal to surrender to winter. Strong's final journal entry from that night, and we're lucky this survived, preserved by his descendants, reflects on his journey. He writes about desperation leading to discovery, about how the worst moment of his life created his greatest achievement. But the line that really captures his philosophy comes at the end. He writes that sharing knowledge freely created more wealth than hoarding it ever could. That's profound, coming from a man who survived in an era of cutthroat competition. Strong had every reason to monopolize his discovery. Every economic incentive pointed toward exclusivity. But he chose cooperation. And that choice didn't just save his life, it saved hundreds of lives and transformed an entire region's development pattern. Today, if you visit Yellowstone National Park, some of the historic lodges still use geothermal heating systems. Modern systems, of course, with metal pipes and automatic controls and engineering that Strong couldn't have imagined. But the basic principles? Those are Strong's. Gravity-fed flows, mixing valves for temperature control, overflow systems to prevent pressure buildup, mineral management to prevent scaling. These fundamentals come directly from techniques Jedediah Strong developed with frozen fingers and desperate innovation in 1823. There's no statue of Strong in Yellowstone, no major memorial. Most visitors have never heard his name, but his legacy is literally beneath their feet, warming the buildings that allow year-round park operations, making comfortable tourism possible in a region where winter temperatures still regularly hit 40 below zero. Sometimes the greatest innovations don't come from universities or corporate laboratories. Sometimes they come from one person facing impossible circumstances and refusing to accept death as the only option. Strong didn't set out to revolutionize frontier heating systems. He just wanted to survive another day. But in solving his personal crisis, he solved a problem that had limited Western expansion for generations. That log crumbling to ash in December 1823, that moment of absolute desperation, it led to a revolution in how humans inhabit cold climates. Not bad for a Pennsylvania stonemason's son who just wanted to trap beaver and stay warm. The frontier rewarded innovation. But it rewarded shared innovation even more, and that might be Jedediah Strong's greatest lesson, that in the harshest environments, cooperation beats competition. That knowledge shared freely multiplies faster than knowledge hoarded. That sometimes, saving yourself requires helping everyone else too. Winter still comes to the Rockies every year. Temperatures still plunge to 40 below. But people stay warm. They've been staying warm using Strong's principles for almost 200 years now. Not bad for a desperate man with frozen fingers and one last chance at survival.